Good morning, everyone. My name is Chad Simmons, he, him. I'm with the Vermont Housing Finance Agency, and along with Jess, the two of us will co-moderate today's Housing 101 session, kind of building the foundation for understanding our housing systems. So before we begin, just a couple of quick housekeeping things before we get started. I'm going to talk just for a minute. Jess will kind of introduce a few key terms and activity, and then we'll get started with the first morning presentation. And how about a round of applause for Heather McGee again? We are just so grateful and blessed that she was willing to be here with us and kind of help think about progress and moving forward. So before we begin, this session is being filmed and recorded and will be available on the conference website after today's conference so that you all can share it with colleagues and others in the field. And so there will be a list of resources. We'll have a link up at the very end, but a list of resources of key terms, and all of the slides will be available for people to see afterwards as well. Before we get into the presentations, just a few words about why this particular session has been a mainstay in the housing conferences over the last 20 years. And it's really about having a firm foundational understanding of the system that exists is extremely important. It's imperative in order for us to change things for the better. And so we've invited these brave souls here today to help us understand how things currently function, where we're at right now as a state, and how our funding, our policies, and our programs work right now so that we can collectively, as Heather spoke so eloquently this morning, that we can build a solidarity dividend so that all folks have housing and the services and supports they need to thrive in that housing. So that's why we're here today and we're holding this session. And we invite all of you to think about the role you can play individually, but also in your communities, to be, as Heather left us this morning, to be the weavers in our communities. So thank you for being here today and helping us understand how these dynamics that we currently have allows us to lift up the parts that work and to change the parts that don't quite work. I'm going to hand it off to Jess Hyman, who is co-moderating, to give you a little bit of fun for the morning as well.
Thank you, Chad. Hello, everyone. I'm Jess Hyman with the Champlain Valley Office of Economic Opportunities statewide housing advocacy programs. Quite a mouthful. Really happy to see so many people here today. As Chad mentioned, this session's intended to give a foundation for how this really complex housing system works in Vermont. So we'll be talking about that basic context, what the data shows. We'll be looking at the magical map of how all these intersecting organizations, policies, and structures fit together. And then we're going to talk a little bit about navigating the housing system and how it works for actual people. So through all this, we're going to be hearing a lot of words. How many of you are new to Vermont's housing world? Quite a few. You're in the perfect place. How many of you have been hearing a sea of acronyms as you're learning your new jobs? Yeah. It's a lot. So we are declaring right now, this is an acronym-free zone. So those of you who got here early got the special privilege of being helpers. So what you got is a list of acronyms and you got these party whistles. So what we want you to do is anytime any of our speakers or anyone in the audience uses an acronym without defining it, we want you to blow them. So just check to see if they work. Those of you who have the blowers, can you just... Excellent. Okay. So it's a very, very important role, and also brings some levity to this heavy system. And so you're going to be learning a lot. You're going to be hearing a lot of new words, concepts, new structures. As Chad mentioned, there will be resources that will be shared afterwards. There are a lot of resources available to help bring you up to speed, and our amazing speakers will help us with that. There'll be opportunities to ask questions. So after each, we have a short amount of time to cover a lot of material. So after each speaker, you can ask very quick clarifying questions, but we'd like you to hold more substantive questions to the end where there'll be time for a more robust discussion. And we're going to be touching on the higher level issues, introducing a lot of themes. We're not going to be able to dig into everything. There are some things that we want, we might not get into as deeply as we'd like to, topics such as home buying and home ownership, including really important BIPOC financial empowerment programs and other programs that are out there. But there are a lot of experts who can help connect you to those resources. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to our panelists, and we'll be starting with Nate Lantieri from VHFA. That was a test. Excellent. Thank you. Vermont Housing Finance.
Yeah. Don't make it good.
Yeah.
Hello, everybody. Thank you all for coming here today and for coming to both this housing conference and to this particular session. It's great to see so many interested community members, folks who are interested in becoming housing advocates, whatever that means. So my role in this position is my position in this presentation is to level set us here a little bit about what do we mean when we're talking about housing in Vermont. So my position with Vermont Housing Finance Agency, VHFA, which I think if you introduce the acronym first, it's okay to clarify after. All right, just level setting, So within, I realized that we haven't really had an introduction to what Vermont Housing Finance Agency does. So very briefly, Vermont Housing Finance Agency is the main vehicle that helps fund and develop and finance affordable housing in Vermont. So that manifests in about 14,000 affordable subsidized rental units and 9,000 plus. The number can get really large when you look at the whole history of VHFA, the whole 50-year history. Assistance to first-time home buyers and many home buyers who are getting them more affordable rates when looking to buy their first home. That's 90% of what Vermont Housing Finance Agency does. And the remaining 10% is our community relations and research team, which is where I sit, as well as Chad. And one of the main things that we do is we provide public data about housing and the different aspects that impact our housing market. Wages, number of homes, location of people. And that was the impetus and the main kind of guiding resource for the recent statewide housing needs assessment, HNA. I've introduced it, I can use it now. So a little bit about what the housing needs assessment is this is one of really kind of the main central documents that puts all of these data points into one place for the state. This is primarily created to meet federal requirements, Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD. They have certain requirements that they ask the state to meet. The state, knowing that we have this research and community relations team, said, hey, it's that time. It's been 5 years. It's time to update our plan. Can we work with you to make this happen? So we recently worked with the state Department of Housing and Community Development, DHCD, who is the main agency within the state government that works on housing policy and housing funding in certain areas. So we collaborated with them to get this out, and this was published, I believe, in August. So it's very new. It is really a great kind of jumping off point to understand both the very basic concepts of our housing market and our housing stock, as well as diving deep into some of the really specific areas. So just in terms of if you find this document, which you can find on our website or on the DHCD website, you may find a really large document that seems somewhat intimidating. But just know it's actually not that Byzantine. It's not that hard to get into when you kind of start to break it down into its component parts. So there are 10 chapters that are thematic focused, and those are laid out there. And then there are additional county chapters that lay out basically the whole document, but specifically cut to the county level, with a little bit less specificity just because of the data that's available. And if that seems like a lot, there are also 10 topic fact sheets that get you the quick hits of what some of the most important concepts and data points are. So this is pointing towards the future of, I'm just going to be baseline level setting some of these data points today. If you want to dive deeper into it, the Housing Needs Assessment is a great resource. And I'll also make a plug towards my session in the next block, which is a deep dive into housing needs data. So if 10 minutes isn't enough, you can do an hour and 15 with me. So taking it away, some of the top line takeaways that we found from doing this exercise were these kind of broad concepts that just keep in mind as we're going through the next stage of actually talking about the results. These are some of the things that we took away. There is a housing shortage that was exacerbated in the last few years. Particularly within the existing housing stock, there are housing quality concerns that exist for various reasons, mostly age of the housing stock, but also some other physical vulnerabilities. Considering that we have this housing situation going on, the hardest hit are likely and are currently low-income households, renters, and many marginalized groups are the ones that are feeling the greatest impact of this shortage and increasing costs. And looking forward, we know that the number of people who will need service-enriched housing, different kinds of services in housing are going to rise within the state beyond the need currently. So these are the top line takeaways. Keep this in mind. The rest of the data points are going to kind of point in this direction. So when we talk about housing in Vermont, what does that mean? A few just very quick definitions. It's important to think about your housing stock. That is the number of homes, the number of buildings that can house households, which are the people that live together within a home. In Vermont, we have 339,000, approximately, homes. These are dwelling units that could be used for full-year habitation. However, we have only about 272,000 are occupied by year-round households. Level setting that, there's about 643,000 people, which says that our household size is about 2, a little higher than 2, and that's something that's been going down over time. When you break it down, most of our housing stock are owner-occupied, about 60%, 196,000 homes. A lesser portion, but the next largest, are renter-occupied homes, about 76,000. A unique characteristic of Vermont are the 15% of seasonal homes. These are homes that are considered, the main data source that we use for this comes from the Census Bureau, the decennial census, and another product that they have called the American Community Survey. And I will certainly dive more into the logistics of those in my next session. But they classify, you either have a year-round occupied home or a vacant home. And that includes homes that are used for secondary usage. Vermont has 51,000 of these, and this puts it at the highest rate in the country. Maine and Vermont are the only two that are up at that 14%, and this is something that's been a legacy of the state for a long time. It's not new that these seasonal homes have been here. They've been about 10% of the housing stock since 1940. What does that mean too? As our housing stock has grown, so too has the number of seasonal homes. And you can see on the right, we're talking a little bit about the change in that overall housing stock broken down by decade. So as you can see on the graph on the right, that is showing what the average annual rate of growth in the occupied housing stock is. It's kind of wonky, but if you think about it in 10 years, say there were 10,000 homes produced, you break that down, every year that's 1,000 homes. The housing stock at this point, what's that percentage? So as you can see, the rate of housing growth has gone down every decade since the 1980s. And you might say, oh, well, the number of homes was less in the 80s than it is today. That is true. But even so, the rate, the annual increase in the number of homes in the last decade was less than any other period since prior to 1970. So that becomes really obvious when you look at this breakdown of our housing stock. Vermont has among the oldest housing stock in the country. More than 25% of the housing stock was built prior to 1939. That's not a direct correlation in between old housing stock and poor quality. You could have a Victorian home from 1860 that is, updated to the nines and it's perfect. You could have that same Victorian home that hasn't had that maintenance, that's been deferred for many years, and is really putting someone into some sort of housing unstable situation. 96,000 homes were built prior to 1950, and that's a useful proxy in that prior to that time, that's when more of these building materials such as lead paint and asbestos were used. And we know that not everybody has the tools or the means or even the knowledge to know that these are things that they need to be working on in their home. A little bit about what some of these physical buildings look like. There's a lot of information there, but really the main thing that you can take away is look at the difference in between that blue section. So that blue section are single-family detached homes. If you think about a home on an individual lot, roof, picket fence, that's your single-family detached home. As you can see on the left, we have our owner-occupied buildings, and on the right, we have renter-occupied buildings. About 85% of the owner-occupied homes are these single-family detached homes. On the flip side, 72% of the renter-occupied homes are in multifamily buildings, whether it's a duplex or a large 50-plus unit development. We see this real difference in where owners are living, what kinds of homes they're living in, and what kinds of homes renters are living in. So it's not a one-to-one sorting that you can say all owner-occupied homes are single-family, all renters are in multifamily buildings, but that's generally kind of how the sorting is going. And the renter housing stock is moving more towards multifamily buildings as single-family are seemingly exiting the rental market. We don't know where they're going, but presumably you can say these are people that are purchasing them for their own owner occupation. So with that in mind, I'm going to present this this graphic that basically is reflective of the whole housing needs assessment. This is kind of in some ways, one of the most important takeaways that you can get from that document. So it's pretty complicated looking, but I can break it down into kind of two categories here. So if we're thinking about the next 5 years and we need to quantify how many homes we need to meet the current housing gaps as well as additional projected demand to live in the state, we have a few categories that we need to be working on. So I'll start with not the bottom one, and I got to reorder these next time. I'll start with the second one up and the one above that. So the 3957, that's working with addressing the current level of homelessness. That number is the number of direct individuals who identified as being currently homeless during the 2023 point in time count, PIT. That's kind of the main standard metric for understanding homelessness within the state. It's not a perfect metric, but it's a pretty useful proxy. Below that, we have the number of homes needed to normalize vacancy rates. Vacancy rates are the homes that are available at any one time. So we would need immediately to add that many homes to offset the current challenges in the rental vacancy market. The lowest one I'm not going to stay on too long. As homes age, they sometimes leave the housing stock. Those are to just account for the number that we anticipate. The top two are additive and looking at basically what we've seen in changes in the housing market in the last 5 years. Prior to the pandemic, there was a lesser change in the population in the housing stock. After the pandemic, there was increased demand to live in Vermont. So we can basically think of if over the next 5 years, if there is a lower projected demand, it's all of those ones from the lighter green bar downwards. Should demand increase and stay at that pandemic level, we will need that full 36,000 homes to meet projected demand. So that's immediate housing gaps on the bottom, projected additional demand. Who's hit the hardest? Of course, we can think about many of the marginalized groups. I'm not going to read this, but we can think about who those might be. And I'm going to point towards a resource beyond, as I mentioned, there's a session that I'm doing in the next one. I hope to see you all there. But I'll also point towards a tool that you all can use that we maintain, and I kind of mentioned as the basis for the housing needs assessment, and that is the website housingdata.org. That's a Vermont-specific website. It's just housingdata.org, but that is a Vermont-specific housing data resource that is public, that all of you can access, and that I maintain and VHFA maintains. So if you want to see some information that's specifically about your town, about your county, about some of the specific metrics that we're not looking at in the needs assessment, or you want different times or years, this is a great resource that you can do that. So it's just housingdata.org. That's the full URL, and there's a few different areas for that. So thank you all for having me, and I'll pass it off to, I believe, Jess is up next. Yeah. No? Jess isn't next. Chad is next.
Behind the curtain. I thought you were going to be behind me.
I know, right?
That's Alma right there. Yep.
There we go.
Get it. Presenter mode. Good morning, everyone. Still morning, right? All right. Don't worry. Don't panic. Here we go. Hello, everyone. My name is Sean Gilpin. I am the Housing Division Director for the Department of Housing and Community Development. We're part of the Agency of Commerce, so the state's housing department, not to be confused with the state's housing finance agency and the state's state housing authority or any of the other state housing entities that we have. So I've been given the impossible task of going through an incredible amount of information. And so by retribution, I sent this to Chad only at 3:30 yesterday. So we'll see how this goes. I feel like we both need to share in some stress. So we'll see how this goes. But what I'm about to do is basically drop a big half gallon of Ben & Jerry's ice cream on you. It's all going to be good stuff, but you should not eat it all at once. You should wait until Chad's got the resource guide out to you later. You can do what my sister does and dig for the exact little chunkies that she wants in there. And I'll throw in some sprinkles on top, just things to think about as we're going. And I want to start out actually taking a big step back and ask the question, why housing? And obviously, it's always great to see this big a group in a Housing 101 class. It's always great to see that many hands go up about when asked about who's new to the housing environment. It's very exciting. Obviously, you are all a self-selected group of folks who decided to spend a lovely sunshiny day talking about housing stuff in a windowless room. And I have an affinity to your spirit. And so with that, I hope that in most of your experiences so far in your introduction to the housing realm in Vermont, you have not had anybody ask you that question, because it should be obvious to us all now. But despite my svelte figure and young demeanor, I've been around this long enough to actually remember a time where that was a question that would be asked in every legislative committee room that we were in every advocacy opportunity. Why is housing? I have a house. Everybody in my town seems to have a house. What do you mean there's a housing crisis? Now, obviously, we hear it perhaps too much sometimes. I know that my staff can get really bogged down sometimes in headlines: housing crisis, homelessness crisis, housing, homelessness, people are unsheltered, we don't have enough housing, it's a decades-long problem. So not only is it important to remember why we focus on this, but it's also important to remember that it is an incredibly important need, and there is a reason why there finally is the level of attention on it. Our keynote speaker this morning spoke about this, where a lot of people just seem to be ignorant of the problem for a while. Now, we all know housing is shelter. We have, again, been reading the headlines. I'm sure people see it in their everyday lives. People who are unsheltered in our communities, and that is a truly difficult thing. Housing is also much more than shelter. It gives you access to an incredible amount of things. I mean, most folks are in this room, I'm sure, when they chose where to live, whether it's rent or home ownership, you were thinking about proximity to your job. And not just proximity to your job, but also how you're able to network to get different jobs or be more resilient in your own employment. Same with education. Most people think about the school district that you're moving into, particularly if you have or are thinking about children. Access to transportation. Are you going to have to drive 40 minutes to get somewhere? Are you going to have a car? Or will you have access to other modes of transportation, other things? And it goes way beyond that physical infrastructure, but also Things like that we probably think of as maybe secondary, but access to recreation, access to that public pool that no longer exists, or the park, that might be nearby, so that you don't need as big a yard or can afford, a smaller space. Also exposure to environmental hazards, whether they're in the house or outside of it. We still deal with lead paint in Vermont all over the place and all over the country. That has a huge effect on childhood development, on interaction with other children. Exposure to high crime areas is a huge issue. That can add to somebody's trauma and stress and really affect way beyond just their housing life and where they sleep at night. And has been spoken before, generational wealth, for better or worse, and I'll follow up on that. The housing is likely to be the most, the greatest asset, the most valuable asset that people in this country will eventually own, should they come to home ownership, which frankly is shifting a little bit. We won't get into that, but that ability to mortgage that asset, to take equity out of that asset, to invest in education, to invest in something as simple perhaps as a car repair that keeps you employed and keeps you in that home, and also being able to pass on that wealth to the next generation. We have a, forgive my terminology, but I say this a lot, we have kind of a schizophrenic mentality about housing in our country right now that I think we still need to grapple with. On the one hand, we expect housing to always go up in value so that you can have that generational wealth, but we also want affordable housing and housing availability. That's a sprinkle to keep in mind. Also, why housing? It has very long-lasting effects, not just the physical effects on ourselves and the households, as Nate brought up, the people who live in the housing, but our policies have had lasting effect. I'm going to breeze over this a little bit because Ms. McGee did a fantastic job of covering some of this, but one of the things I want folks to take away is we need not only new housing policies, but to remediate the damage from housing policies that have happened in the past. Things like redlining, things like blockbusting, and this was not a set of well-meaning but poorly aligned people. These were actually part of the policy. It wasn't a couple bad actors. It was written into best practices for realtors in the 1930s, right through the 1960s, that it was poor practice to position somebody of a different race into a neighborhood that was primarily one race. This was written up in the training manuals. Our government's policies specifically focus solely on, or almost solely on, white individuals. They've left out a lot of people, and there is a lasting effect. You'd like to think, oh, this was, that's ancient history. That's when we were still had the black and white photographs of the marches and whatnot. It's not. There are people in this room right now that were around when the Civil Rights Act came about in the 1964. And that Civil Rights Act didn't actually go so far. That was what allowed for public use of buildings, so no more whites-only water fountains and the like. It did not go as far as housing. You were still well within your rights to discriminate on housing right through 1964. And it wasn't until shortly after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. that the Fair Housing Rights Act was passed. And that actually made it explicitly illegal to do a lot of the policies that were enacted and were being acted upon for decades. It still has not gotten us far enough because there's actually been some really interesting studies in the last probably 5 years or so, now that we're getting more into mapping, where you can actually put old red line district maps on top of current income maps, and they match up. In Philadelphia, in Baltimore, in Boston, in New York, those households have been affected literally for generations. And so I implore people to put it out of their head that this was some sort of old issue that no longer affects us or that we need to reconcile with it in a historical context. It's now. And I also touch a bit on, I know that some folks are probably, who here is aware of the idea of 30% of your income going to housing being considered affordable? Okay. So that concept came about when the federal government started to get into the housing development realm during the Great Depression, and especially with the GI Bill after World War II. Originally, that came from the idea that a week's wage should pay for a month's rent. So 25% of your income should cover your housing costs. Where they came up with that, I don't know. It was probably in some jingle in the 30s. But when the government was deciding, when the U.S. government was deciding, okay, what should we be responsible for in order to ensure affordability, they said make it around 30, and we'll go with that. Now, obviously, that is a poor metric, because on the top end of the bell curve of income, you could spend way more than 30% of your income on housing and still have plenty for all the rest of your needs. On the bottom end of the income spectrum, you could be spending 30% of your income and still be absolutely not meeting any of your other needs. And so consider that just a generality. And now there are a lot of folks who are actually suggesting that perhaps that should include transportation, and say that 45% of your income should cover your transportation and your housing costs, because people are moving further and further away from jobs, education, places of interest in order to afford the housing that's there. I'm going to take a little pivot here and go into some of the fair housing law that was talked about just a second ago in 1968. The Act protects people based on certain, there's no way to make it bigger up here, is there? The Act prohibits discrimination based on certain things. And the second bullet here are the federally designated bases: race, color, national origin, religion, sex, familial status, disability. So no one can explicitly discriminate against somebody based on those characteristics, lest they be in discordance with the federal fair housing law. I want to point out here too, every one of us falls into each of these statuses. This is not this sword cuts both ways. This protects everyone. I think too often we think about the Fair Housing Act as something that protects minorities. You can no more lawfully say, Black Jewish people only, nor can you say white Christians only. This protects everybody, and I think it's important for us to remind ourselves that this is a universal protection based on largely immutable characteristics. And Vermont went a little bit further, and Vermont actually has added these statuses as well: sexual orientation, gender identity, age, with some limited exceptions. And our most recent one is victims of domestic violence, stalking, or sexual assault. So you can't say to somebody, I'm sorry, I won't rent to you. I heard your boyfriend is a problem and he might come around. We also actually protect receipt of public assistance. And that is enormous. A lot of states don't have that. I'm sure folks are aware of the Section 8 housing choice vouchers. And many states, a landlord isn't required to rent to somebody who has one of those, simply because that's how they're going to be paying. The logic of that, I don't quite understand. It's guaranteed income, but nobody asked me. That is probably one of the biggest, that and familial status and disability, those are like the top three for major discrimination cases in the state. Receipt of public assistance is a huge one. So for all of you who do frontline social work, and you have people asking a landlord, do you accept Section 8? Their answer better be yes, because otherwise you should be talking to the Vermont Legal Aid and Human Rights Commission, or Jess's shop, a little bit to talk about what rights are. However, with all that, this has been incremental. And because of that, we have a very complicated system, because it's been built in little pieces throughout over time. Our biggest, how am I doing with time? Oh, shoot. All right, I'll be moving quick. Wait, I have 6 minutes left or six? Okay, shoot. So folks are probably familiar with our major housing sort of funder on the federal level, the Department of Housing and Urban Development. And they administer several different programs that are all included. These three that are here: Home Housing Investment Partnership largely goes to home ownership development. Community Development Block Grant goes through our shop to do, we actually in Vermont do a lot of housing development with those monies as well. And the Housing Trust Fund is thanks to Senator Sanders. That's been established and now funded, and we received that for shelter grants. These are all included in what's called the consolidated plan, which Nate's housing needs assessment speaks to. I encourage folks, there'll be a link later in the presentation that folks will get when that gets sent out. And already mentioned the Section 8 housing choice voucher. They can either be with a tenant is most common, with a project is possible too. And that's one way that we help support housing development. We also have USDRD. No, come on, nobody with the, no, I was hoping to get all right, you guys got us. I know, so that's the Department of Agriculture Rural Development, which Vermont uses a bit of. I did not even try to list all of the programs that they have because it is such an absolute mess of stuff. And the other major one, and this is a graphic that was put together by Polymajor, or at least was included in a slide by Polymajor. Low-income housing tax credit, affectionately known as LIHTC, that runs through the Vermont Housing Finance Agency, is a lovely little tax scheme for us to get money from private folks to use now in exchange for tax credits that they get to use later. That's right. I mean, it's
totally. We would
yeah.
use the word scheme.
Yeah, that's what I thought. We use a lot of LIHTC. I encourage people to look into that. There's also a number of home ownership, and I do want to point out at the very bottom, the mortgage interest deduction. For those who just love a gotcha moment, the home mortgage interest deduction is by far the largest federal subsidy for housing, and it mostly goes to people who make over $100,000. It has likely inflated the cost of home ownership over time, and I doubt I'll see it gotten rid of within my lifetime. But that's a fun thing to research. And then I'll go real quickly, the state housing agencies in Vermont, you can see this is almost intentionally obfuscating because we have a very decentralized system. But you don't need to memorize this. Please don't. There's probably better use of brain cells. But the major ones are Agency of Human Services, which deals with our folks who are experiencing homelessness along with a lot of other things, but they oversee a lot of the shelter development. We've already gone through Vermont State Housing Authority, administers the Section 8 rental vouchers, VHFA, VHCB, and well, actually, VHCB hasn't been introduced yet. The Vermont Housing Conservation Board is a particularly unique organization to the state of Vermont. I'd encourage folks to check that out. They do great work. I know that there's a few staff members of theirs wandering about. And then our office as well. And then I will, we've talked about, I will say, so there's a link up there when Chad sends out these to the consolidated plan page. We also, I'd encourage folks who are interested in learning more about the fair housing to check out the website, our website for the analysis of impediments to fair housing. So we actually every 5 years do a deep dive along with the housing needs assessment. It's a really interesting document this time around. I don't know if Jamie Bauer is in here, one of my colleagues, but she helped put that together and actually did a lot of focus groups along with Jess's crew to talk to folks with low English proficiency and address, some of the needs that we have in that community, which is generally concentrated in Chittenden County, but we're starting to resettle folks in other places in the state as well. And I know I'm going, I'm going to, how badly do you want, we're good? Okay. All right, so we have a number of policies in the state of Vermont that go above and beyond what are required of our federal partners. By and large, the biggest one is that affordability piece. So housing that's developed with these programs that I told you about, the CDBG, low-income housing tax credit, and Vermont Housing Conservation Board's funds, unlike most places in the country, those funds are required to go towards housing that maintains affordability in perpetuity. Most places in the country, most states, put money in for a certain amount of time based on the program requirements, usually between 15 and 30 years, and then they essentially flip them. We don't do that here because we feel that a public investment should have a longer tail than that, and frankly, we don't want to sprawl and build all over the place in order to maintain affordability. There's a number of other policy priorities in there that I think will probably be pretty logical to most folks. And I do want to point out two of the new programs that our office is working on is the Vermont Housing Improvement Program and the Manufactured Home Improvement and Repair Program. And these are examples of that smart growth, incremental development that is also a huge priority for us. We don't want to see the sprawling, sprawling development, the strip mall style way of going about building up, whether it's for commercial or for our housing. In most places, a 50-unit building in the country, in most places, a 50-unit rental building is not that big a deal. In Vermont, that's gonna change the entire nature of a community. And so we have actually, those two programs are working on reinvesting in our community centers, which we have identified through a smart growth program. Hopefully folks are somewhat familiar with that. And we make sure that we're trying to create smart growth. And this is a quote from Act 250, which is on everybody's lips these days because it has a huge effect on how we use our land. Vermont has done a lot of work in making sure that land is developed in a way that maintains the things that we find most valuable, including compact, vibrant centers with working lands in between. And part of the way that we do that is by planning on a state, regional, and municipal level and creating designated centers. So I'm sure most of the folks in here, I'm sure have visited, downtown Burlington, Bristol, all these other communities throughout that have these compact, walkable centers. We actually do a lot of work to make sure that those places end up receiving particular benefits in order to encourage the type of housing development that we want in those areas. Because it's really important that you not only have, retirees and second homeowners in your neighborhoods, but you also need a population, families that have a population that can support your school. You need working folks who are able to do the work of, firefighting, a teacher, staffing your grocery stores. We need a broad swath of people and people of different ages. And one of the things that we're actually seeing is because of the smart growth focus that we've had, we're actually starting to see a lot of the benefits of realizing that as our population ages, they can actually start to move out of the large homes that they had populated with a full family and back into the compact, smaller unit in a walkable area where you have a neighborhood around you. So I would posit the magical map is actually all of us and our connectivity between each other, because understanding the needs of your particular area, especially now in light of the election, is going to come back down to local real fast. And that is going to be the way that we move forward with our housing needs. So with that, that's my contact info. I'm not otherwise hard to find, but I might not get you the PowerPoint until the last minute.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Great. And now we'd like to welcome Jess Graff and then Kalia Livingston from CVOEO. And see?
She introduced it at the beginning. Hi, everybody. I'm Jess Graff. I am the director of Franklin Grand Isle Community Action, which is a program of CVOEO, the Champlain Valley Office of Economic Opportunity. I am also a board member of HHAV, which is the Housing and Homelessness Alliance of Vermont. And I sit as a chair to the Vermont Balance of State Continuum of Care, which is also most commonly referred to as a COC. So chair of that board as well. And today I am talking to you about the three legs of the stool, which is a common term that we talk about in homelessness response and responding to housing insecurity as a strategy for solution and knitting together all of the pieces of the housing puzzle to make sure that people everyone has housing, and that we can support them in their times of need. I think I've best heard the homelessness crisis described as a game of musical chairs, knowing that we don't have enough housing to meet everybody's needs, and knowing that that not everybody has always the skills and ability to get into one of those chairs. And so we have a system of services and supports that can help with that. This is a very broad, quick oversight of some of those services. And we'll be talking about coordinated entry, some about availability, affordability, services and resources, and availability, affordability, and services are the three legs of the stool. In the world of homelessness response, we are looking to fit together all three of those legs. I can't see this on here at all. Is there a way to make it bigger on the slide? I have middle-aged eyes.
I do as well, and ears. It is not.
No,
No, is that not big enough at all?
no.
Oh, it's too big on the screen.
Can you make it smaller? I don't have my reading glasses.
Do you want me to read? You want me to read it?
No, that's okay. Okay. So the three legs are availability, which we think of as the production, and making sure that that production is appropriate to homelessness response. Affordability, which we achieve through often vouchers, subsidies, and hopefully, in some cases, people are required to set limits on the amount of rent that they're able to charge. And then services, which connect people to housing and also keep them there. And then HUD, the Housing and Urban Development, requires us to have a system called coordinated entry, and that's nationally. Each state has a system of coordinated entry. Coordinated entry is a process, it's not a program. It's a process through which we ensure that people experiencing a housing crisis are assessed and then referred to programs and services and resources to help them address that housing crisis. Coordinated entry is administered through lead agencies that are designated in each community. Not only do they serve individuals experiencing homelessness or housing insecurity, they also are the community weavers that connect the agencies in that community to make sure that they're coming together to spotlight those most vulnerable and make sure that their needs are met. And through coordinated entry, we connect people to case management, we provide housing navigation, a whole variety of services. One of the reasons that I am drawn to the field of housing is that there's no subject that it doesn't involve or touch upon. There's no one client in my world. There's no one common factor. It's the full spectrum of humanity, and each person has different needs and resources that we need to pull together for them. We can connect them to resources like HOP funding, and in some cases, even certain housing. HOP, the house, that's the sound of shame. I love acronyms. I think that it's the most efficient way to speak. But yeah, the HOP is the Housing Opportunity Program, and it's my favorite tool in the work that I do. It is funding that allows us to prevent homelessness by paying up to 3 months of somebody's security deposit when they're facing eviction to keep them housed, and end homelessness by giving them funding for a security deposit and first month's rent and sometimes other needs to get them into housing. I think it's the most important resource we have available to us. Certain types of funding used in Vermont to create housing to address the availability crisis require that the property owners offer available units to people experiencing homelessness, which is something that we call a homelessness preference. And we talked about VHIP, there's some other programs that do that. And so when you'll see this big new exciting building going up, there's often a certain percentage of those units that are available, and they contact their lead agencies and they say, we have 6 units or 11 units, can you send us people? And we look at our coordinated entry lists of the individuals who are experiencing homelessness and are able to refer people off of those lists to match them to the units that are available. And that is a very satisfying solutions-focused moment. Through coordinated entry, we also are able to connect people to resources that deal with the affordability of the housing crisis. And there are really sort of 2 types of ways that we address affordability. There's project-based assistance or tenant-based assistance. Project-based assistance is where the rental subsidy is attached to the unit. And so the amount of money that someone pays in both cases is often that 30% of their income. And then the subsidy covers the difference between that and the rental amount. And tenant-based assistance is often a housing choice or Section 8 voucher that somebody would carry, and they'd be able to use that sort of on the open market. The project-based assistance, often people can access those through applying to a variety of units or housing providers that hold those. Tenant-based assistance, that's often actually harder to access in general because those tend to have even closed wait lists. They don't have wait lists open, or the wait lists are open only for small, categorically eligible individuals. The project-based assistance often has wait lists of 1 to 3 years, and tenant-based assistance can not even have an open wait list, so it can be much harder to access. Great. And is that my last slide? No. Services. Services come in many forms, but it's very complicated because we don't have universal services. We always talk about how that's a problem. They're based on household demographics, and some common examples of that are age. They can be place-based, like for people who are living in a certain type of housing development. They can be based on having a certain condition or an experience. Oh my gosh, you should be blowing your thing. I put acronyms in here and didn't even spell it out. Domestic violence or Department of Corrections. They can be embedded based like in schools or doctor's offices, or they can be based on income, and those are just a few examples. So a lot of what we do is matching people, sitting down and finding out about the person and then matching them to the service that they qualify for that best meets their needs. Can be 2 types of, one example of services is housing services. Housing navigation we think of as helping somebody who it might be experiencing or at risk of homelessness find a stable place to live, and then housing retention is keeping them in that place as long as they want to be there. And that is it. I think I was right on time. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Jess. And now I'd like to welcome Kalia Livingston from the Champlain Valley Office of Economic Opportunities Fair Housing Project to talk a little bit about navigating the system and resources.
Hi, everyone. My name is Kalia Livingston, and I am a part of the housing advocacy programs at CVOEO, the Champlain Valley Office of Economic Opportunity. Sorry, I can't say that in one breath. My specific role is the Fair Housing Project Education and Outreach Coordinator. And part of the work that I do is to go out into the community and teach people about what fair housing is and what their fair housing rights are. However, today I'll just get into a brief discussion of the origin of the Fair Housing Act, as well as resources that we have available at CVOEO. So the Fair Housing Act kind of stemmed from the Civil Rights Act that was enacted in 1866. And that was enacted right after formerly enslaved people found freedom in the United States. And it basically defined what citizenship looks like and who has it. And formerly enslaved people were allowed to have legal binding contracts and get into lease agreements. Unfortunately, this act was not very enforceable based on the socio and political climate that still existed and the general attitudes and sentiment towards slavery that were still heavily prevalent in society. So in the upcoming decades, housing discrimination became super prevalent and legalized through redlining and steering and other forms of legal segregation. So that became a huge issue in the United States, which led to the second version of the Civil Rights Act, which was enacted in 1964. And that gave more protections to people regarding employment and voting based on race, skin color, national origin, and religion. And just a couple years after that was the Fair Housing Act came out of that second form of the Civil Rights Act, and that was in 1968. And Sean did discuss what protected classes are protected under the Fair Housing Act. However, it just initially started with protecting people based on race, skin color, national origin, and religion. Unfortunately, because we are in such a tight housing market and we're experiencing a housing crisis with such limited access to housing, we find that illegal housing discrimination is more prevalent because housing providers can act on their implicit biases to determine who they want to rent their apartments to. I recently went through the process of looking for housing as a first-time renter, which was a very stressful experience, although I do have some things in my favor. I'm gainfully employed, I'm college educated, I am able-bodied and pretty savvy with phones and computers and the internet. So that made it easy for me to communicate with people as I was looking for housing. And even with those things in my favor, I still had a lot of trouble finding a home at a fast rate. It took me about 3 to 4 months to secure housing. I went through probably 15 to 20 showings, but eventually I did find a great apartment and was able to stay within that 30% income bracket of what's considered affordable housing. That's really fortunate for me. However, people who have membership of the protected classes that were named earlier can have lots of barriers when looking for housing, especially with such a tight market and a vacancy rate that's incredibly low. The vacancy rate is out of 100 apartments, how many are available and ready to be rented. And a healthy vacancy rate looks between like 3 to 5%. However, in Chittenden County, it's less than 1% right now. So that is a little bit of a perspective on how limited housing is. One of the things that I didn't have in my favor when looking for housing was having rental references because I'm a first-time renter. But one thing that helped me was going through all of the renters workshops that we provide at CVOEO. And doing that, I was able to earn a certificate through our tenant skills workshop, which basically teaches folks of what their rights and responsibilities are as renters. And I was able to utilize that and add it to my rental applications to kind of show that I was ready and knowledgeable and wanting to have the most successful renting experience as possible. And I think it made a big difference in my ability to find housing. Some other resources that we have at CVOEO include our other two renters workshops, which is the Finding Housing workshop, and that gives people tips and tricks about how to find housing and navigate this very tight housing market. And we also have Sustaining the Rent, which talks more about the financial piece of how to maintain your rent, budgeting tips, and building credit and things like that. Some other resources that we have at CVOEO through our Vermont Tenants program, we have a Vermont Tenants hotline, which is a statewide hotline. Anybody who has any issues that come up in their renting experience, they can give us a call and we can help them navigate that situation and hopefully find a resolution for them or point them in the right direction. And when it comes to fair housing issues, if someone experiences illegal housing discrimination based on membership of a protected class, they can also reach out to us and we can help them. We can assist with helping them file a complaint with either the Vermont Human Rights Commission or through HUD, which is also known as the Department of Housing and Urban Development. So we have some really great resources to help people stay informed of what their rights are and hopefully empower folks to be more aware of how they are protected by these laws, which are self-enforced, and just making sure that that becomes part of the general culture where tenants can be aware of what their rights are. Although I know that it is an extra layer of responsibility to have to know what your rights are and advocate for yourself. Part of what we do is to be a support and help people in navigating through those tough situations. And that's all I have for you today. We do have lots of resources, which I will put on the table there.
Thank you to all of our panelists. I can't stress enough, we asked the four of them for a huge amount of information to provide to you all in a very short period of time. So we've got about 10 minutes that we'd love to hear your questions that came up over the last hour. And so I'll be, where's Sheila? Yeah, Sheila here. Sheila's going to be passing around the microphone, so if folks have a question, please look for Sheila. Is it on? Yes, it is on. Yeah. Right there, and then Sue.
And as we're waiting for the first question, I also want to give a shout out to Melissa Kane of Iceberg Consulting. She's in the back corner and she's been diligently taking notes from today's session as well as the keynote. Along with the resources that we'll be sharing later, that with information about all these different organizations and systems you've just been learning about, we'll also share another version of the magical map that'll help connect us all to this great information. So thank you, Melissa.
Hi, my name is Carol. I'm with Northgate Residence Ownership Corporation. And we actually were one of the recipients of the biggest CDBG grant ever, I believe. And that was in 1989. So we have seen our demographics really flip in our communities. For every 5 children in 1989, we had 1 or 2 adults. Now, for every 5 adults, we might have 1 or 2 children. And we see people aging in place. So I'm sorry for the assumption, but I'm assuming that the data does not include assisted living when you talk about housing. Is that true?
Can you all hear? Yes, you can. You're right in that those numbers are not captured in those same statistics that I was showing, but there's a category called group quarters, and that kind of gets at all of the other kinds of housing arrangements that are a little bit more non-traditional. So there are about 50,000 people in Vermont that live in various forms of group quarters, which include institutional settings, such as corrections facilities, assisted living, rehab facilities, university dorms, and more congregate elder facilities. So that's slightly separate because doesn't fit into that, owner, renter, occupied bucket. But certainly important that there are about 50,000 people living in these other areas.
Well, and so my second question to this is, we have residents who are aging in place, obviously, and they can no longer take care of themselves. And their units are not accessible. And their families come and they're like, what do? We just have no idea. So Kalia, my question is, can we access CVOEO and oh, sorry, and see if you all can help a resident with getting into assisted living?
I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with the particular project, but what region is it in? Burlington. So yes, sorry. I'm a little north. Then I think absolutely reach out to CVOEO, and maybe Jess Hyman can figure out who would be in the Chittenden office that would be better able to sit down with somebody. We have housing navigators that could help them sign up and access whatever is next for their housing needs.
And I'll just point out, I think the question then brings up a really great point that I think will be discussed in both the legislature and as we continue to figure out how we meet our challenges, what accessibility looks like for our housing, especially as Nate pointed out around our aging housing stock and how that creates a bottleneck for people to have choice in where their housing needs should be and can be. I think Sue in the back. Can you? Really loud enough?
Hi, thanks. I'm Sue Graff. I'm with the Agency of Human Services. I'm a field services director. I serve the Brattleboro and Springfield districts. Similar to that question, I think my question is, what would it take to match the resource of overhoused folks, so people who are aging in place who can't stay in their home or don't want to, have too much space? What would it take to incentivize or match make those resources, or second homeowners, or all the sort of, we have housing stock that is underutilized, or we have space that's underutilized. What would it take to match make those things? And I know we have some programs like home sharing and things that are not all over the state. And we have incentives like apartment and home programs in Brattleboro, and some innovative things are happening, but that feels like a shorter term solution, and I just don't know enough about what it would take. I also want to, in response to the last question, want to say through the Agency of Human Services, we work with our area agencies on aging pretty significantly. Those are great resources for seniors who are looking for those additional resources around moving into assisted living. So there can be some assessments and strategic thinking with families around resources for seniors through your local area agency on aging. There are 5 of them around the state.
Thank you, Sue. Sean, I don't know if that might be a question around how we as a state are addressing some of those.
Oh, well, Nate has some thoughts too. It's a great question. And I'm going to go out on a limb. Obviously, Home Share is a fantastic organization. They do great work. It's high intensity work, though. It's not, frankly, it's a lot easier theoretically, in terms of the steps needed and the emotional investment to build a new building often than it is to coordinate. Because we all know that housing is, not only is it all the things that we've talked about, it's also an emotional connection. It's not a pure economic commodity. So having those social connections are really important. And frankly, from my perspective, I think we need staff and we need a concerted effort to make those connections. I don't think historically that the state government certainly hasn't, and the feds haven't either, gone out so far in that level of detail. And so I think as the seams, so to speak, are being stretched more and more, we are going to see more of those efforts. And I hope that we can better coordinate, the folks that are on the ground working on this. But frankly, I'm sure everybody on this table and most of the people in the room, everybody's overclocked. And so trying to come up with new initiatives has been really difficult. But I hope it's something that we can overcome with a lot of the new folks in the room who weren't here 2 years ago. I think Nate had something.
Yep. I'll just add, in terms of the somewhat mismatch in between housing sizes and home sizes, it's another pitch for my next session. I actually have the data on that. But kind of as an example, if you think about, say, someone has lived in a town like Highgate or Randolph or any of the small Vermont towns, that they don't actually have that many homes in them. Perhaps they know that their home does no longer fit what their needs are. And you'd think, okay, great. There are some assisted living facilities, some elder care facilities in the state, but maybe not in Highgate, maybe not in Randolph. So the sacrifice is move out of your home, potentially sacrifice some of your independence, and almost certainly sacrifice your community. So it's really a situation of when we do not have the housing stock to meet the sorting needs of these various groups, of elders that need 1 or 2 bedrooms, of young families that need these 4-bedroom homes, there isn't that mobility because there just aren't the homes that people need. So that's one angle. And then the other consideration is really policy. We can't tell people what to do with their homes, but there are some levers that we can facilitate it to make it so that people are more incentivized to use it in that way. Things like with the homestead declaration, different areas where people are disincentivized by counting everybody's income in the household, and they lose incentives that, you know, the more traditional nuclear family gets. Even just still, that's written into our policy. So there's many levers, and many of them are indirect, but it's all hands on deck.
So we have time, unfortunately, for one more question because we do not want to get in the way of lunch. So I'm going to call on the last person to ask the question, and then we're going to wrap up before lunch. So I apologize that we didn't get to all of them. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Julie Mazzarello. I work with Department of Children and Families, Economic Services. I've case managed low-income families for over 30 years and worked with homeless. And I've tried to help people apply, you know, this. Do you foresee like being like one application? So I apply at one place, I help somebody, and then, oh, well, you need this application too, and you need this application too. And they worked with me, and then, oh, they went to the Haven or to another facility, and they go, I don't know where I filled out. And so they're repeating it again. So there's no comment. It's like we already work so much, and we don't have that case management that it just seems like we're just doing double the work a lot. The other thing is to get landlords involved is that we are trying to help them understand that if we case manage them like for a year or follow them to help them so that they know how to rent and they know how to take care of their housing so they're not going to be back out again, teaching them budgets and all that. We don't have enough of that staff as well. We all know that. So, but just trying to make it simple wherever we can is kind of the thing that wondering if anyone knows that could be something that could happen in the future.
Oh, we really agree with you. It is such a complex system of resources and services. In some ways, the VHIP made it so that all of the landlords for that program had to accept the Vermont Common application. But that really that's one example of like, yes, we have recognized that.
Like Housing Trust, we use that.
What's VHIP again?
He introduced
Someone blow their whistle.
Vermont Home Improvement Program. I have a list behind my computer at work so that I don't have to do this in real time. And I hope that we agree with you, and I hope we can work on that. I can't say that there's like this one resource, but yeah, for case managers that they'll be finding a dozen different places that they have to help people fill out applications for. It's very complicated, and then region to region there could be 12 more resources if somebody moves, there's not records of them necessarily. It's very complicated. I don't have a great answer for you, but I validate and agree with you.
Have 30 seconds.
20.
There's a timer going.
I believe it. I don't follow timers. I think it is, just to reiterate everything Jess just said, it's definitely an issue. It's part of that incremental, piecemeal process that we've put together. Lots of different programs that overlap inefficiently or perhaps not at all. I think VHIP was one of the things that you had said that I did want to bring up is having landlords get engaged. And one of the things that I think the Vermont Housing Improvement Program has really shown is that we're actually recognizing a lot of smaller scale landlords throughout the state that aren't even aware how they can engage in the process and engage in being part of the solution. And it has been honestly really, really eye-opening about how many property owners around the state, once they're invited in, are willing to be part of the solution. And so I think that is, it's not a silver bullet, but it is something that, in this state, I think we're better situated than elsewhere. But one final shameless plug is that the Department of Housing and Community Development is probably going to be hiring soon. So if you want to work on the solution or VHIP or manufactured housing improvement repair, come find me after.
Okay, thanks, Sean. So yeah, it is a complex and challenging. Housing is a complex and challenging problem, and the solution is right here in the room. All of you are part of that solution. So look out for the more info and resources. Also, we'd like to draw your attention to the Housing and Homelessness Alliance of Vermont, which is a statewide membership organization that represents affordable housing needs. Join hhav.org. I also want to put a plug in if you want to learn more about how you can get involved at a local level in helping solve your housing needs. There's a housing committee meetup during the afternoon break in the atrium. So come join us, whether you're part of an existing municipal housing committee or would like to learn how to get involved. That's another connection point too. And I will turn it over to Chad to close us up. And then it's lunch.
I know it is lunch right now, so I am going to attempt to summarize what we just talked about here and let you go on your way. So data can inform decisions, and stories and experiences can inspire positive change. Our system is complex and in many ways opaque. How can we humanize how the housing system functions, and how do we ensure fairness? Vermont's affordability is a value here in the state. And a big question that we have is, where do we place our housing? And the smart growth is a way that we have articulated that. The three legs of the stool, as just described, is ensuring people are not just sheltered, but are successful in being sheltered. Fairness in times of scarcity may oftentimes be overlooked. Finding a home is difficult with the vacancy rates that we have across the state. And sometimes when we have challenges, we access these tools. So like the resources named by Kalia and CVOEO and are ways to meet those challenges. And finally, as Sean was just discussing, the new tools and the new people, like all of you, are what we need to meet our housing needs. So thank you all so much for your time this morning, and enjoy lunch. Thank you to our presenters. Yes, please.